one and only agenda item, our Open Meetings Act presentation, and I turn the floor over to you, Rhonda.
Thank you. Give me 1 second so I can actually read my notes. Here we go. I'd like to thank the board for allowing me this opportunity to come in and do some education, overview, and training on the Open Meetings Act. I'm Rhonda Stowers. I work at Plunkett Cooney. It is one of the oldest and largest law firms in the Midwest. It has about 140 attorneys. We have multiple offices, not just in Michigan now, but we've expanded out.
I'm sorry, may I interrupt for a point of order? Especially since this is an Open Meetings Act presentation, are we allowed to have the door shut?
Oh,
Would you please open the door again? I just thought there was a certain irony there.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Sorry, thank you.
Please go ahead.
The firm has a governmental law practice group which has about 20 attorneys in it, of which I am one. I've been doing municipal law now for it'll be 20 years in June. I advise clients obviously on the Open Meetings Act, FOIA, I do charters, we do litigation and defense, particularly of FOIA and OMA actions when those happen. So I appreciate the opportunity to come here and talk, but enough about me. So the Open Meetings Act is kind of a trend that started in the 1970s for the most part. Utah back in 1898 had an Open Meetings Act. Florida had one in about 1905, but the rest of the country not so much. And then Watergate happened, and all of a sudden there was a bit of a mistrust in terms of government and the openness of government. And so when that happened, the federal government and the state governments began passing acts, including, Congressional Code of Ethics came out about that time. Federal campaign financing was reformed around that time. And there was the Government in the Sunshine Act. And what the object of this was to make sure that all open meetings of all multi-member governmental agencies. So when you had a agency that had multiple individuals in it, those meetings were to be open to the public. Michigan followed suit. In 1976, it enacted both the Freedom of Information Act, which allows the public access to records and documents, as well as the Open Meetings Act. Now, the Open Meetings Act, the Michigan Open Meetings Act, specifies that it supersedes all of your local charter provisions, all of your local ordinances, all of your local rules. So anything that you might have on the books that's inconsistent with the Open Meetings Act is trumped by the act. All right. So, like we're talking about, it applies to state or local legislative governing bodies. The term governing bodies, it means an actual body. You can't have an individual that is subject to the Open Meetings Act unless they are a member of a public body. Members elect, if they're not on the public body yet, but they're going to be on the public body, they are not technically members of the public body to whom the Open Meetings Act applies. I feel really weird doing this sitting down, just as a side note. I'm used to, I teach at police academy at Mott Community College, and I'm used to walking constantly while I'm talking and gesturing, and it's kind of unusual to be sitting and doing this, so bear with me here. You can have a public official who is a public official and still not be a member of a public body. If you have like a school superintendent, they're a public official, but they're not necessarily a member of the public body. We had a case involving a village clerk where we had an OMA action was brought. It was actually filed by Phil Ellison, someone you might have heard of, where he was alleging that the clerk had violated the Open Meetings Act. Well, under the village charter of this particular village, the clerk was not a member of the board. They were just the clerk. And he tried to argue that they were a public official and therefore this act applied. And we successfully argued in front of the court, no, it doesn't apply. They're a public official, but that's not the same thing as being a member of the public body. So when we're talking public bodies, it does have to be a public body or a member of a public body. Now that does include your committees and your subcommittees and authorities and councils. So designating something to a subcommittee or to a committee is not going to get around the act. And this tends to be a sticking point for a lot of communities. I had one recently where they like to create subcommittees of all kinds, and then they say, well, they're just providing advice, they're not really committees, but you get into a fine line. If you have a situation where your committee is making determinations about, okay, we're gonna narrow it down, something that had 5 issues to it, and we're gonna narrow it down to 2, and then the board's gonna decide on this one based on our recommendation, and you've got a board that just rubber stamps, that's a problem. Anytime you're taking away the decision of the board to make a public decision, that's going to be a problem. So anytime you have a committee created, when you create it, that is going to count as a public body in and of itself. And it's because it's, as long as it is, meets these criteria, the one of which that I just put up, empowered by law. It doesn't have to be a state statute. It doesn't have to be constitutional. It can be your charter. It can be an ordinance. It can be a resolution. It can be a rule that you came up with. That, okay, this committee is going to have this authority. If they are exercising any kind of governmental function or a proprietary function on behalf of the county, they are going to be considered a public body. So that's something to keep in mind. I've had municipalities just fracture their board into 1,000 committees, and then every one of those committees, the safest thing, best practice would be to go ahead and have them have open meetings. It's not required in the sense that if you have a body that has no authority whatsoever, they're going to make a recommendation. They're not narrowing any issues. They're just kind of looking at information or gathering information and then presenting it to the board as a whole. And now the board is making the decision. That's not going to create an issue for you. But what's going to create an issue for you is a circumstance like we've seen in case law where, okay, we have an open position and we're going to narrow it down to 1 or 2 candidates from a wide field of candidates and only present these 2 to the board. Well, they've made some decisions, and those decisions have been in meetings that should have been open to the public, if that's what they're going to do. It's not to say that you can't designate things down, but if you do, you need to be aware that that designation should allow that meeting to be open to best protect the county. And if anyone has any questions while I do this, please let me know.
It sounds like you're talking about not just elected people, but people who are employees of the county?
It could be any board or committee or subcommittee, and it doesn't matter who's on it. What matters is whether it was empowered by law. Whether the council made a motion, for example, or how the board was created. I mean, if a bunch of citizens get together and they decide, okay, we're going to have this board, that's different than, if the county decides, okay, we're going to make this motion or have this resolution where we're going to have this subcommittee on a particular issue.
What if it's a single person?
That gets dicey. A single person is not a public body under the OMA. So like, for example, your city manager in a city would not be a public body if you're designated it to one. I guess the question in that circumstance would be whether you've delegated your authority to this person and created this board of one to engage in a council function that would have ordinarily had to have been done in a public meeting. That's kind of where you want to look. For example, in this slide, you can have a lessee who's performing an essential public purpose or a function pursuant to a lease. They would be considered to be a public body. So it's not necessarily, it doesn't have to be just governmental officials or just city employees or county employees. It can be a group of anybody. A group of one is generally not considered a public body unless the whole reason you were doing this was to make it so that you could avoid the Open Meetings Act by delegating your authority to a single person.
So can I ask a question, just kind of an example?
Yeah, absolutely.
So it is, in our board, it is the board chair's authority and responsibility to make appointments to all of the sort of councils and subcommittees and authorities that are connected to this board. And so, but this board votes on those appointments. So are you saying when applications come in, I have asked before, I would like to see all of the applicants, even though the chair's authority is to make the appointments, there's a filtering that has happened. Like these people were not chosen and these people were. And we have to vote on that. Is that what you're talking about or not? Is it, if that's that person's authority, can they just do that without the rest of the board knowing the filtering that happened?
In that circumstance, I think the best practice would be for the board to request all of the applications so that you have them if the recommendation is just one or two individuals. If the board wanted to consider, you know, how you ended up with the recommendation that you had. You can, there is a provision, we're going to talk about it quite a bit later, about in closed session where you can have applications, when you're considering an application for an employment or appointment, and it's been asked to be confidential, you can review, go into closed session to review those applications and to consider them in closed session. However, when it comes to interviews and actually making your selection, that has to be done in public.
What often who she's talking about is simply based on, there's so many boards around and appointments come up. It's simply a matter of, oh, we have these two, this one seems better. As the board chair, I'll recommend this or whatever. I become a filtering mechanism of one. Because I'm chair. And that's only one example. And I know the gray areas that I'm reminded of the lawyers I've talked to over the last 7 months who are giving me the same probabilities you are with not a lot of definite. I mean, our county coordinator often winnows things down for us.
I'm not a member of the public body.
You are not, but yet it is your, we do legally hire you and we give you certain authorities that, because obviously we cannot handle the day-to-day things. So when does it become a day-to-day thing and when does it not?
Well, there's a question I always have is how the agendas are created and how things are filtered. So some things, some agenda request items don't make the agenda and others do. Somebody decided that before it got to us, and it's always unclear to me exactly how that process works.
Well, and again, we'll get into this later as well, but agendas are actually not a required item under the Open Meetings Act.
Right.
You don't have to have an agenda other than you probably have rules of order that require you to have an agenda. You know, keeping in mind the purpose of the act is to give the public access and a voice in government. So if there is an issue that people feel should have made the agenda or didn't, or that they felt the board should have considered but it's not on the agenda, there is public comment for that where the people can come in and say, hey, wait, you know, I think the board needs to consider these issues. I would like to see the board consider these issues and bring it before the board.
But then it takes a supermajority of the board to get it on the agenda.
Only if it's,
Right.
so any committee would just take up a simple majority. So like, I think one time I tried to make a stupid motion for, solar farms. Right. And then- because said, let's do
It
a
was your
moratorium.
words, by the way.
And, you know, if that would have been supported, right, that would have been majority of the agenda, and that would have been up for discussion. Now, I always thought that the way we should handle appointments would be, here's a list of all the names, everyone gets them, and it shouldn't be where one of the committee members, because it's usually goes through a committee, makes the recommendation, the name, and then it's discussed. Instead of having, I mean, a lot of times, there's 2 openings and there's only 2 applicants, that's different. What if there's like 20 applicants and 2 openings? You know what I mean?
Well, here's a
She's got a
thought.
point, that sometimes you get 3 names for, there's been 20 applicants.
If I may interrupt, excuse me, we're now getting beyond Open Meetings Act stuff.
Well, no, I mean,
I think
how,
what we're talking
how,
today
the
about is
question is, how
legalities.
do we, things have been moved down before, at least in the board before. What's legal, what's not?
Certain offices have statutory powers, including that of the chair. So lots of times in city council charters, it is the job of the mayor to bring forward appointments to boards. And
So if there was an
likewise-
appointment, because we all get the packet though with all the names and stuff, right?
Yeah, I give you all.
Yeah, we
those.
have, so if there was a name that I thought wanted to be considered, even though it was the one brought forward, I would simply have to bring up in committee, hey, this is a name we also want to consider.
Right, yeah, or we just asked Morgan, oh, hey, who applied? I mean, it's not that hard. She,
We get that in our board packets.
right,
but
I mean,
the
it's
public-
very simple.
I guess my point is the public don't get our board packets.
No, and if they did, they'd have to have all those things redacted, including.
Yeah, no, I'm not advocating that that's.
So is this Open Meetings Act stuff, or what do we?
Well, that's what I was saying, we seem to be getting.
It's a question I have, so I think it's relevant. I'm just trying to get everything straightened out because we're here for a reason.
For Open Meetings Act?
Yeah.
It was a question, I think, originally on when the board is not properly delegating authority down to one person. And I just see an uncertainty about where the line is for that. And I don't think it's something necessarily you can answer for me, but I do see the gray area that one of my frustrations with the Open Meetings Act is I don't know if I'm violating it until there's a lawsuit sometimes
Yeah.
and I lose. It hasn't happened with me personally yet, but it certainly is one, as I've come to understand the gray areas of the Open Meetings Act, that you just don't know. I'm not an attorney, I'm a retired IT guy, and when I have 4 attorneys, all who give me 4 different answers, I say, how am I supposed to know? It's a problem.
It's a valid complaint, and there is a lot of gray area in the Open Meetings Act, just because it really depends on what issue is in front of you, you know, how the particular meeting goes that we're talking about, how the committee is made up that we're talking about, what decision was made, and how much debate or information went through council. It does tend to be very fact dependent, and because of that, it is hard to say definitively this would be, this wouldn't be. What I can say is the safest, best practice is to err on the side of openness, try to bring as much to the public as you can, and that way, if nothing else, you won't get hit for an intentional violation because your effort is toward openness and transparency, which is the whole point of the statute. So if I didn't answer your question, that's.
I'm not blaming you. It's all right.
I'll give you your probably 5th different answer, but and to keep in mind too, if you have a committee of one, and the purpose of that one committee wasn't because you wanted to violate the act, it was because it was necessary in order to forward the business, it was too much for council, it needed to be narrowed down, winnowed down in some way, and you come to council and you explain, this is the process that I used, this is why these people were not chosen, this is why these people are still on your list, and here is what I think you need to do moving forward, and the council can ask questions about that, they have input about that, they can reconsider names that maybe were left off. That's still very open and very public. So the whole point of this, obviously, with very, very few exceptions, and there's intended to be very few exceptions, when there's a meeting, it should be public. There should be members of the public there if they want to attend. which seems like a simple thing to say, and then you have to try to define a meeting. So a meeting has basically 3 elements to it. One is that you have a quorum. 2 is that they are deliberating or rendering a decision. And 3, that decision or deliberation is toward a matter of public policy. So that's your, if you had to do, okay, am I in a meeting right now because we all got together and then we started talking about the plowing issue that we have, you know, now you've got an open meetings question. Whether or not something is a decision is pretty broad under the Act. Just looking to see. So a decision is a determination, an action, a vote, or a disposition on a motion, a proposal, a recommendation, a resolution, an order, an ordinance, a bill, or a measure on which a vote by members of a public body is required. So if it's required that you vote on it, it's a decision. It's also a decision if you're formulating public policy. And so, like we discussed, when a quorum is present, it could be a meeting. If you are intending to create sub-quorum groups in order to discuss something that should be discussed at a board meeting, obviously that violates the Act. You're not allowed to purposely have sub-quorums in order to avoid the consequences of the OMA. One of the cases that addresses this is booth newspapers, and probably if you've done any OMA at all, just about every time you get into it, it's a booth newspapers case. You have booth newspapers versus Wyoming, booth newspapers versus University of Michigan Board of Regents. They tend to do a lot of litigation, or did back in the day, back in the 90s. So where you had in the Wyoming City Council, what they did was they had a lunch meeting involving one group that was a sub-quorum and another lunch meeting involving a different sub-quorum group. But where the total number of attendees of both of those constituted a quorum, the court said, yeah, you can't do that. You're not allowed to break your council into pieces and have pieces working in order to avoid the Open Meetings Act. Now, this does not include chance gatherings. And the Open Meetings Act does not define what a social gathering or a chance gathering is, which again gets into our gray area, but you know, it's not always clear when you have an issue. The idea being, whenever we're talking about these exemptions or these exceptions to the OMA, you have to think that any time you're saying it doesn't apply, courts are going to take that very strictly. They're going to limit the exceptions on which this could happen. It's going to be narrowly construed. It's going to be construed against the government, and it's up to the county to explain why an exemption does apply or why it wasn't an OMA meeting. The burden is actually on the county as opposed to on the plaintiff suing, which is normally the case. Normally in litigation, it's the plaintiff's burden to prove that you did something wrong. Under the Open Meetings Act, it's your duty to prove that you didn't do something wrong. So it's kind of reversed.
Is that become a problem in court? I mean, that's contrary to, how things are done.
It's at least, it makes the litigation more interesting.
Oh yeah,
because you have to be much more on the offensive when you're defending OMA cases and explaining you know, why you did what you did. The benefit of it is that you get to explain and outline what happened. I mean, plaintiff can too, but it's focused on what your interpretation was of what happened, more so than plaintiff's.
I understand.
Because you're the one that's explaining what happened. Then the court has to look at that to see whether or not you've proven it. Now, it does give you the burden of proof, which isn't as much fun. It's much more fun to sit back and say, I don't have to prove anything. You know, it's on plaintiff. You can't do that on these.
I have a question about intentional subquorums. Are our committees of 3 then an intentional subquorum? If, say, our finance committee, which is 3 people, get together with Dr. Boggs to discuss an informational thing on here's what's going on with the bonding. And by the way, you might even say, I have to decide sooner, we're going to have to decide the following things. Maybe it even leads to a discussion, I don't know. Is that an intentional subquorum and does it violate the act?
If you're not saying, okay, let's all meet in secret so that we don't have to worry about this OMA issue, or gee, this is something I want to say, but I really don't want the public to hear it. I mean, in terms of willfulness, that's what I'm thinking of when I say intentional. Now,
Well, it is intentional in that come to my office at 10 a.m. on Monday, and I'm gonna update you on. I'm just giving this as an example. Because it's on our bonding. You're the finance committee, and it'll be up to the finance committee later on to. And who knows if the finance committee meets? I don't know. I
Yeah,
asked-
I'm on the finance committee, nobody told me.
Pardon me?
I'm on the finance committee, nobody told me about
We
this.
try to keep things secret from you.
You guys,
I'm just saying as far as how committees work, and I asked that question because when I asked it to attorneys months ago, I was told, oh yes, that could very well violate the Open Meetings Act. Like I say, I'm getting lots of different answers on this stuff. So I don't know.
I would expect that a lot of attorneys would tell you this may violate the Open Meetings Act because like I said, the caution and the default is always to openness. And we as attorneys and probably people in general, but I can speak for attorneys, we don't like to nail ourselves down by saying what will absolutely happen or what absolutely will not happen. We like to have that wiggle room. We like to make sure that our advice is sound but also safe. So in that sense, but it depends a lot, and this goes to the next point, on what's being said. If you've got a committee that's getting together to get information, and they just say, okay, I have this, you know, I'm going to report as to what we've learned in terms of, you know, the trailway and what it's going to cost, for example. If all you're getting is information and there's no deliberation, there's no comment, there's no discussion about, you know, how do we feel about it, or do we think this will make it easier or harder to vote for? If it's just gathering the information, that's fine. If it's gathering the information so you can make a recommendation, and all you're doing is making a recommendation to council that then considers the issue as a whole and looks at the entire picture, that's fine. What gets you into trouble is when you are deliberating or discussing how it should go or the pros and cons of it outside of the council, outside of the open meeting. If you're going to have a meeting like that, you should have it be open, just to
I
be
just
safe.
heard two opposite things. The committee can get together and discuss what recommendation they should make to the board. You can't do that without looking at trade-offs. Everything's trade-offs, and the committee can't do that. Can the committee or can it not discuss what they should recommend to the board? Because it seems that's what committees are all about.
If all they're doing, if all they are is a advisory committee, then you're fine. Once you get outside of advising the board, once you get outside to them making the decisions about it's going to be X and not Y, it's going to be Z and not Q, and then the board doesn't get to make those decisions like we talked about before, that's when you start getting into the issues.
So in other words, if they were presented with 4 plans, but they decided in the meeting, not with a formal vote, but just through discussion decided, we'll take these 2 to the board, that's where it crosses the line.
If it's toward,
Ish.
yes, that's where it at least starts raising the question. Let's put it that way. If all you're doing is, like we're doing here, this is like a workshop or like an informational thing. I'm giving you information. We're not deliberating towards public policy. You're just getting information from me and for your benefit, or hopefully for your benefit. This is not necessarily something that would have to be public, because it's not moving toward a decision. You're not creating public policy and deliberating on issues that the public should have access to and doesn't. So I don't know, did that answer your question, or?
It seems to render the work of our committees impotent, because they can't, we say if there are 4, what if there are 50? Does the board have to consider as a whole all 50? We can't have a committee that looks at this and says, well, 45 of these are ridiculous, so we're only going to really look at that, because then they've made a decision. The rest of us might not agree with all 45, but that's why we assign committees. I said, John, you know a whole lot about finance. You're going to be having a finance committee, and we're going to trust you to do it. But now I'm hearing we can't do that.
Why can't you just post that meeting and have people be there? Why
Yeah, you can't not, you can have the meeting, it's just in that instance, it should be an open meeting.
Well, because sometimes they're fairly informal. But if that's what you're telling me, that anytime our committees meet informally, just, okay. I need to know.
When you say meet informally, again, it doesn't matter how formal or informal it is. It wouldn't have to be in this building. If they're deliberating toward a public policy that's going to affect the county, the public has a right to be at that meeting and
Yes.
hearing those decisions. That's kind of where it comes down to. So it is a little bit of a hassle, and I've had, like I said, I had one municipality that split, I don't know, I think they had like 30 committees. And they're not that big. And I'm like, I didn't understand it, but I'm like, okay, but they didn't want to have all those be public, and they're like, well, gosh, why do we have to do that? And it's like, well, if you have committees and they're making those kinds of decisions, best practice, you want to have it open. And 9 times out of 10, you may not have a lot of public interest. You won't have people there regardless, but you've done the steps, you've posted it, you've taken the minutes, you've allowed the public in, and you've protected yourselves from an OMA claim.
But if you're not deliberating, you said if it's just informational. So John, when we've sat there and we've heard, somebody from MERS talk
Thrown
about
on,
things.
yeah.
Yeah, I was gonna say that. And no decisions are made, we just listen. So that does not have to be a public meeting, correct?
Correct. If all you're doing is listening and gathering information, that's not a problem.
And I think that's a lot of what.
That is a lot. That's a lot of what committees do.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that.
Sitting there and listening and listening and listening to this stuff. And no one even wants to discuss it afterwards. You're just listening.
Yeah, you want to get away from the around the horn kind of decisions where it's like, okay, we're going to make this decision and we're just not going to make it public. Those are the ones that cause problems. If you're just gathering information, you're fine. The other thing that's fine, if you're just finding out, is there enough support for this to pass? How would a particular commissioner vote on a particular issue? That's not necessarily a problem. Now, if you send an email out and you say, hey, here's how I'm voting, this is why I'm voting this way, I think y'all should vote this way too, and they respond, well, I don't think we should vote that way, I have this other opinion. Once you start getting into that discussion, now you've got a problem. But if all you're doing is a quick canvas to see, okay, do we have votes, how many votes, okay, now I know where things stand, that's not.
Okay, now,
Me too.
With-
I thought
with
that's
that-
one of the things we
with
couldn't
that,
do.
caucuses. I mean, we're all Republicans. Now, how does that work? I mean, if we're stymied and chairman of our party says, we need a caucus to discuss things, how does that work? I mean, Republicans, the political parties can't caucus
Yes,
and
they
talk in
can.
private.
And the act does cover caucusing. I wasn't really expecting it to come up in this forum.
No, okay, then I won't,
But yeah, there is a provision in the OMA where it addresses state caucuses and what can and can't be done.
What do you think of that, John?
Now, big cities with certain parties in power all the time, when they decide they want to make some decisions that should be out here, they form a caucus. We go into caucus and say, well, we're talking party politics. And they work.
Well, and we'll get into this too, but once you get outside of the purpose of a closed session, and I want to say that's where caucus is in there. I don't do a lot of state stuff, so it's hard for me to say, but I think that's where it was. When you're in a closed session, you can only talk about whatever the purpose was that you went in closed session. You're not allowed to go outside of that and discuss other things. So if they're calling a caucus for a particular purpose and now they're talking about other issues or making, and you're also not supposed to make decisions in a closed meeting. So to the extent they're making decisions and deciding, okay, we're gonna do X, and then they come back out, you get, it's not good. It's not good to be making decisions in closed meetings. And I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yes, it does, yes. I'm just saying, that, sometimes it's, yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's not vote determinative in terms of whether or not you have a quorum making decision. There doesn't have to be a vote. If you've got a collaboration where you're all talking about, okay, this is what I want to do, or this is what I think, and you're having a back and forth discussion about it, or even everyone agreeing to it, you are in a circumstance where you could be doing, unless there's an exemption and you have a closed session that's appropriate for that purpose, you could be running into trouble. Yeah, one of the courts indicated, and this is another reason why everything's kind of loosey-goosey when it comes to the Open Meetings Act, is you have decision that's defined very broadly, and then you have deliberating, which is not defined at all. So what the court did, the court looks to basically when as a rule of statutory interpretation, if you have a statute, it's got words in it, they're not defined elsewhere in the act or in that statute, the default is you go back to the dictionary, and you look at the dictionary definitions. So they initially said that it was carefully considering the issues, and then it became analyzing, discussing, weighing evidence, exchanging views on something, a debate. So the court basically took all of that and said anything like that happens needs to be in public.
Of a quorum?
Well, that's the other thing. That's actually next on my list. Again, if you have a sub-quorum and it's not a chance gathering, if it's not information, if you've got something that's a delegation of board power, it needs to go in front of the full board for the discussion portion of it, or it needs to be an open meeting, an open committee meeting.
So does that mean you can discuss policy with one other member? Is that an intentional sub-quorum?
If you're intending it to be, yeah. The commissioners are intended to act as a group. No one commissioner has power. You have to act as a whole. It's your decisions as a whole that determines public policy.
I guess I'm asking, can I talk to the commissioner on my left and say, what do you think about the, agenda item A, Open Meetings Act, informational item? Is that allowable?
It's better that it occur at a public meeting.
Okay.
Let me say it that way. I mean, the idea that you guys will never discuss things relating to public policy.
That's just,
Well,
if
wouldn't that
anyone
fall
thinks
under
that that's possible.
canvassing and informal polling him, asking him?
I mean, if you get into a large discussion about what you think should happen, that discussion should happen in this room with the board present, not individually.
So the informal polling you're saying is just kind of asking how somebody's gonna vote without asking all the reasoning behind it and the deliberations, because that should happen here.
Right,
Okay.
What do you think, but not why?
Right.
exactly.
But what if it's not how you're gonna vote, it's simply, hey, do you think, bonding is a good idea? Hey, John, you know a lot about this, do you think bonding's a good idea?
Absolutely, yeah.
It seems I can't ask him, but I can ask my neighbor.
Well, and it depends. Are you asking about bonding, whether or not he thinks it's a good idea because you're just curious whether or not he thinks it's a good idea, or are you actually intending to bring it up at a board meeting in the future and you need to know which way he goes?
It's generally being discussed, and it's part of one of the things, and I'm just using it as an example. It's just,
But
Like
saying, you
I
know,
said,
hey, how do you feel about bonding is a lot like saying, hey, how are you going to vote? And it is,
there's always an implied why.
and I'll be the first to say, this is the gray area. These are the areas where councils get tripped up. And that's why any kind of discussions that are going to end up later being a vote on an issue need to be here, because it's the safest thing that you can do is to have it here.
I just always feel like the public deserves to know why I'm voting, how I'm voting. So even if we've discussed it, then probably should discuss it again here, so that there's not a, I mean, they just deserve to know the background behind why I made the decision I made.
Well, and it also comes down to two, are you making your decision based on what was presented to you at the public meeting and in the public eye, or are you basing your decision on something you heard in an email that the public never saw?
Gossip.
Not gossip per se. Gossip doesn't, well, you can say gossip doesn't influence public policy, but just to wrap up the quorum issue before we get to this further deeper into the email and texting. If you call a board meeting and now you don't have a quorum, you're still allowed as a committee of the whole to listen to information just as if you were an advisory committee or a subcommittee, you know, that's just gathering information. What you can't do is then sit there and talk about it because you don't have a quorum present. And you have to have a quorum for your meetings. So yeah, to get deeper into email texting issue, this is hard. Part of the reason is, you know, the Open Meetings Act was written in 1976, and there wasn't a lot of email or texting in 1976. And even though they've updated it over the years, they've been really slow to update it in terms of technology until extremely recently. And even then, they've kind of done a rough job of it to make it more technologically savvy. So the issues with the email and texting, there's not a lot of guidance on there. You'd think by now there would have been a lot more cases. But I think the plain truth of it is you don't get a lot of FOIA requests for board emails. And unless you did,
We
Oh my goodness.
you do now probably.
Yeah,
but-
sorry, we didn't.
We don't film one, we don't film one unless it's once a month.
I don't think I sent an email out to that.
She had to open up that box, didn't she?
I open up every box.
Who sends emails?
Oh.
I don't ever.
And it also includes texting. You know, to the extent that you're sitting on one side of the room and you text over to the other side of the room, I think this is stupid. I'm not going to vote for this. Here's my reasons, or, you know, I think we should make a motion X, Y, Z. Now you are circumventing the Open Meetings Act by sending secret messages to each other rather than having it out in the open in the public where it's supposed to be.
So don't text on the issues, but I can text and say, you look bored, you're falling asleep.
Yes,
That would be okay.
that would be okay. That has nothing to do with public policy.
Or if you're on Pinterest looking at recipes.
So there's really only a few cases that deal with emails and whether or not emails can constitute a quorum. And basically, it's the same it's the same philosophy as when you're dealing with a committee. If you have an email, for example, and you are blind CCing the entire board, and you're talking about how you feel, and anyone on the board responds and gets into discussion with you, now the whole board is having this debate about whether or not something should be voted on or something should be going a certain way, and that's problematic under the OMA. Even,
No, isn't it problematic just because you're discussing with one other member of the board? Or is that allowed? I think that goes back to my original
It does.
statement.
and again, if you're deliberating toward public policy, that needs to be here. I mean, if and you think about Andy Griffith back in the 1950s, 1960s, before the Open Meetings Act, and they could, Floyd the barber's in there and he's cutting the mayor's hair and he can say, hey, I think we should do this, or I think we should do that. Those days are not here anymore. There needs to be more openness, there needs to be more public availability and participation in those kinds of discussions. So if you're having a serious discussion with another board member about public policy or deliberating toward a public policy, it needs to be here. Now that's not to say you guys can't have conversations about other things or things that don't involve public policy. But if it's something that you think you'd have to vote on eventually, that's a discussion that should happen here.
Can I ask one outside question?
Sure.
Kind of more towards Dr. Boggs, but is it possible to clean up some of these gray areas for the board to adopt its own procedures to follow that would be, and in complete compliance with OMA, but to clean up some of the gray areas as well, if it was adopted by the board of commissioners?
Likely no. And part of that is because the law is so situational, and can't write a rule for every single situation that may find itself there. And further, I'm not the counsel for the board, so that would be up to Ron Kinder. But for example, whenever we do have committee meetings, the committee meetings are posted. Sometimes there are times that I have met with John or the chair together, but they are either part of committee and such that they would violate a quorum or violate the committee rules. So I think for the most part, I think the board is functioning as it should. But there are a lot of gray areas around here with some of this, but can't address every situation because the law is situational based on a set of circumstances, and that's why you have opposing party counsel for each one.
What I run into once in a while is, let's say that I use MERS. God, but anyway, MERS would come in, and maybe it was Cindy and I, or it's Greg and I, or it's Brandon and I, to listen to why they made their decision on the actuary table the way they did. Well, then I get accused, well, you had a secret meeting. And all it was is information. What sometimes we don't have is, what do I say to that person? I mean, like, no, it was informational, but they don't want to take it that way. They want to say, you had a secret meeting.
But if we're not voting on it, we don't vote on the actuarial table. We don't vote on,
Right.
so
But
what
that
I'm
doesn't-
hearing
that's
is
not
we
good
don't
enough.
vote on it.
That's what
then-
we have right now. No matter what we do, or if he and I were brothers, and I went over to his house on Sunday for dinner, we're in the paper the next day having a secret meeting. And that's what's going on.
And one of the problems with informational meetings that I'm sometimes uncomfortable with is certainly not my desire anyway to violate the Open Meetings Act, is informational meetings, just the questions you're asking. If instead of an Open Meetings Act, this were a financial, you came to give us information on our finances, the questions I'd ask you are deliberative, or they could be considered that. Oh, you're considering all these different things, and this wasn't open to the public. because I'm asking these questions, I think it could be construed that way. So I understand what John is saying. It can, no intention whatsoever to violate can end up sort of getting us on the edge. And I don't know if you have any other than don't do it. And sometimes for the sake of efficiency, we have to have these informational things. I'm not quite sure what we do about that and still not get on the edge that way.
Well, like I said, informational meetings where you're just gathering information are not problematic. Even if you're just asking, I mean, they're not problematic in the sense that they're violative of the OMA. They're problematic in the sense that people think they're violative of the OMA. And then you're dealing with people, like you said, they're like, oh, you're meeting clandestinely, you're doing secret things, I've often in my police academy class had officers ask, well, can I be sued for this, or can I be sued for that? The answer is always yes. You can be sued for anything by anything. The question is it defensible, and can you present a strong defense? That's what you should really be worrying about. If they say, hey, this is a secret meeting, you can say this wasn't a meeting under the OMA, to which notice was made. It's that simple. I mean, if it's not a meeting under the OMA because you're not deliberating, you're not moving towards public policy, you didn't take a vote, you're not discussing the pros and cons, you are gathering information and asking questions to get information from a third party about, MERS or whatever it is, whatever the question is, that isn't going to trip you up in court. What's going to trip you up in court is if you're having meetings where you're discussing and debating whether or not you should vote a certain way relative to MERS or relative to retirement, that now, okay, this is something that should have been done here and it's being done in closed doors.
So the term there, gathering information, is a pretty strong term.
I mean, I can't say that there's a gathering information phrase, but if you have a body that's advisory only, or you have a meeting that's informational only, where council's not asking questions, they're just sitting back and taking it in. And even in this meeting, you're asking me questions, but it's not determining the public policy that's going to affect the citizens of Shiawassee. Go ahead.
I have an example, and I suppose it's probably not any secret that I'm kind of flying the plane right here, so I'm going to probably read that again. So, I think it was in November, December, we went into closed session to discuss our opioid settlement. We're in a class action lawsuit. And because of the things that have happened in recent months, we now put on the agenda why we're going into closed session with the case number. But it didn't say anything about the opioid settlement, it was only a case number. When we got into closed session, it was apparent to me that I was the only commissioner who did not know what settlement we were talking about. I don't know the case number, right? I remembered that we had joined a class action lawsuit and all of that. Our attorney was on speakerphone. Dr. Boggs said there are a couple of commissioners who have some questions about this, and asked the questions that the other commissioners had. So I asked another commissioner after the meeting, how was it that I was the only person in that meeting who didn't know? I mean, I figured it out in context as we moved forward, but everybody else seemed to know before we got in here what that was about. And the other commissioner said to me, well, we had talked about it in Dr. Boggs' office before the meeting. That feels to me like a violation of the Open Meetings Act. Maybe I'm wrong, but I felt like I was left out of information that other commissioners, I didn't have time to formulate questions because there was a meeting before the meeting where that was discussed.
Where it was discussed, what, going into closed session?
Where other commissioners knew that the closed session thing was going to be the opioid settlement and that they were able to have questions to ask from the attorney when we got in there.
I see.
Well, I think that's an inference. You can't consider what happened in a room that you weren't there. That would be an inference into what.
Okay, so I'm inferring that somebody had some information about that session that I didn't have.
All they asked was, what's the thing about? And informationally spoken, it's about opioids.
Okay. I'm just uncomfortable, I guess, with that gathering before the meeting, but
OGR is a troublemaker, so.
Yeah,
Yeah.
usually I just bring olive dip or some crackers, so I mean, it's not really, I don't know, I always feel like if I have a question, I'm just gonna ask. I'm gonna ask Tracy,
Just like
I'm
you
gonna
said
ask
that we
Morgan.
discussed it in the Open Meetings Act, we never discussed it. I was there, we never discussed one thing about the other things, so. I swear on a stack of Bibles.
somebody knew enough information about it to be able to ask a question, and I didn't have that information, that's all I'm saying.
Well,
Informational things,
Was
again,
that in our-
are not, informational things, well, I hear you wanted to know about this, of course, agenda was out.
We didn't have that was
Was
not, it was a
that
closed
one?
session thing, we did not have
Oh, I
that.
apologize. I didn't
No,
remember
we did
what
not
it
have
was.
any information about it.
I didn't
We had more
remember.
to go.
There was no information attached to that. You don't send out closed session packets ahead of time.
No, but you saw it on the agenda.
It was
You never
posted,
email
right?
me, you never ask, you never follow up. I never hear from you except in a board meeting.
It's because there's an audience.
I used to, until something happened where I can't trust, so that's my issue.
I think we're moving.
We used to have a monthly meeting.
I think we're
So-
moving into a little
Okay,
bit different
that's
issue.
fine, I'm just trying to get my
With
questions.
respect to,
I'm trying to get my
the
questions answered about the Open Meetings Act, because I think it's
Understood,
important.
and what I was saying was with respect to the Open Meeting Act, on what you're saying and sometimes other things, of course, you're welcome. We just happen to, anywhere from half hour to 10 minutes, we arrive at a certain time, and since I've been on the board for a little over a year, it's always, we wait there until we come into this room, but, what's on the agenda informationally can come up, and it probably did that day. I'm sure there were no discussions regarding this is what we should decide, or these are the questions we should ask.
Well, Dr. Boggs knew the questions the commissioners wanted to ask, because he communicated them to the attorney, so that's all I'm saying. Maybe it's not, I could be wrong. It seemed to me like, yeah, I didn't have the information I needed.
well, I don't want to go too far afield. Just generally speaking, we need to make sure that anything that was discussed in closed session is not discussed in open session, because that can get you into trouble. And we will get into this later. If there was not some discourse about what it was, if it was, what's case number X and here's case number, case number X is this case, that information really needs to be out in the public anyway in terms of the name of the case, so that people know, this is the case we're going in to discuss. And we'll talk a little bit more about pending litigation. But generally speaking, you want to keep closed sessions. What happens in closed session stays in closed session. When you're emailing back and forth, it's important to keep in mind, is this something that the public would have an interest in, that's going to be used toward a vote, that's going to be used toward a decision? Is there any back and forth about it? That's where it becomes an issue. In the Markel case, which is the one case in Michigan that really addresses emails, they talked about the fact that it was an email string and only some commissioners were responding back and forth, but all the commissioners were, I believe, copied. And the court said, even though a defendant didn't affirmatively reply to that email, they clearly knew the content of that email, because they had that information that they wouldn't have had but for the fact that they were in this email string. So if you have discussions back and forth via email, via text, in person, you're talking about public policy, it needs to be in this room, not elsewhere. Yeah.
Question about that. How do we individually protect ourselves? Because we've all been in a situation, possibly in our lives, where it can come up where one person has a blanket email, we're going to have a closed session about this, just so you guys know. And someone responds. What about this and this? Someone else responds. What about that? All of a sudden that becomes deliberation. I've never said a word, but I know this could go bad and I don't want to be in trouble. how do I protect myself and say, do I say, hey guys, we can't be talking about this? What would help me so that if it ever went to court, I'm not the guy that you said, he didn't say nothing, but all of a sudden he's getting sued for OMA, even though he didn't want to.
Very often when you see those kinds of emails, eventually you will see somewhere in that string someone saying, hey, let's save this for open meeting.
Yeah. So let's say I'm the guy that says, hey, we can't do this. John's thinking that, but I said it first. Is he in trouble? How do you
You know,
protect yourself?
we have a lot of practice.
We do.
Well,
We have
first
these
of all,
Just so you guys know, I don't want to know nothing.
I mean, in terms
I do
of,
my own research.
in terms of individual board member self-protection, yes, you're not going to want to be responding unless your response is, let's save it for open meetings. You know, this maybe isn't the right forum for this, you know, however you want to word it. Just because someone else does it first doesn't mean that you can't chime in. I also think this would be more appropriate in an open meeting, although if you get too far afield, then you're going to be right back to now you're part of the debate. But yeah, just a single email saying, you know, this is good, we're done here, is just that reminder. Because it's easy to forget. You know, you get caught up in the discussion and you're thinking about things, or you want to get it down on paper before it leaves. You know, and so it does happen. And we'll talk a little bit about what happens when you do have a violation. You know, how can you correct? So obviously, there needs to be public notice. It has to be posted at your office and any other locations that's considered appropriate. Again, the archaic statute says cable television may also be used. You know, that back in the day, that was a proper posting of public notice. If someone requests to receive notice of your meetings and pays some fee for the cost of printing and postage annually, you are obligated to send them notice via mail or however way that they request. But the statute is mail, notice of your public meetings, so that they have that. And then a meeting of the public body shall not be held unless public notice is given. And an agenda is not required. You could go into a meeting and decide, you know what, today we're going to discuss X, Y, and Z instead of A, B, and C that we have on our agenda. That doesn't violate the OMA. You're still doing it in public. You're still at a public meeting. It was duly noticed. Now, maybe someone didn't show up because they didn't think you were going to be talking about it that day, but it still allows for public participation in process.
So we don't make any agendas, we just did the last hour.
Well, again, you might have rules of order that require it, but the OMA doesn't. I mean, and there's been litigation over this where people have gone and said they violated the OMA because they didn't have this on the agenda, but they talked about it. That doesn't violate the OMA. The OMA doesn't say anything about agendas. What you have to give is the name, telephone number, address, and you know, let them know where the meeting's going to be. It doesn't even necessarily have to happen here. You could have it, as long as the geographic location is still not, you know, prohibitive of the public coming and attending, you can have it elsewhere. We've even had, back page of my notes here, or a page of my notes. It doesn't even have to be in the county. It could be outside of the county. You don't necessarily have to have it at your county seat. You could be elsewhere. You could even, and I assume that this happens extremely rarely, but you could even have it at a house, somebody's house, as opposed to.
Oh, no,
But that's only if there's, in the boundary of your county, there's no governmental unit or school system building that's available without cost. But in that limited circumstance, you could even have it in a house, as long as, and there's some additional requirements, obviously, if that were to happen, but you have to let people know that this is where the meeting is, and yes, it's open to the public, and the house obviously would have to be open to the public, if that were to happen. So yeah, you've got the name, you know, the county's name, or the name of the committee, the telephone number, the address, place, date, and time, so that the public can participate. Now, in terms of timing, and this probably doesn't affect you so much as your clerks, but regular meetings are posted within 10 days of the first meeting. When you have your first meeting under the OMA, you're supposed to, for regularly scheduled meetings, come up with a meeting schedule for the year, and put down, okay, here's the days we're meeting. Let people know within 10 days of that meeting where you decide where those meetings and when those meetings are going to be.
10 days?
10 days. You make a decision where it's going to be at your first meeting, and within 10 days, you have to have posted that to the public. So,
We do that.
so that
After
they're
the
aware.
organizational meeting, right?
We adopt the calendar of the organization.
Mhm. Now, if that schedule changes, you have to post it within 3 days of that meeting change. So if you were holding meetings on Tuesdays and now, you know, it's decided at a meeting you're going to hold them on Wednesdays, within 3 days of that meeting where you decided you're going to hold it on Wednesdays, you have to post and let people know.
What about snow? We almost had to cancel, close the county one day this year. We wouldn't know until we get the footage. We didn't, but we certainly didn't know 3 days ahead of time it was going to snow. Or that the power goes out because there's a tornado or something.
Or a fire.
Or a fire.
Like we had.
Well, if there's enough notice, you could have it in an alternative location. If there's not enough notice, or the meeting has to be canceled, you can cancel your meeting. It's not saying that you can't cancel your meeting as long as whatever you were going to decide at that meeting doesn't get decided somewhere without the public knowing about it. It's not to say that you can, you know, the idea is that you're going to have regular meetings. And that should be the rule as opposed to the exception, that your meetings are fairly regular. If you have to reschedule a meeting, you need to let them know 18 hours before that meeting. So, okay, we can't have our Wednesday meeting because there's too much snow, so now we're moving it to Monday. You have to give them 18 hours.
So we don't have 18 hours, but you can cancel the meeting and then have a different meeting several days later.
Well, don't you have to cancel the meeting?
Well, if you have a different meeting several days later, that's your special meeting, and you have to give 18 hours notice
It
of
would
that.
have to be a special then, because you don't have 18 hours. So you don't know 18 hours ahead of time, unless you start canceling every time it threatens to be the snow heavily.
Yeah,
No, I
that-
think she's saying before you reschedule.
the new meeting,
The new meeting.
the one that's being
before
Oh, I'm
scheduled.
sorry.
Not
I
that-
thought we had to do everything at the same time. I
Yeah, no.
apologize. Okay.
Heck with the old.
And if you have a meeting that you've had to recess, as long as it hasn't been 36 hours, you don't have to repost it. But if it's been more than 36 hours, you have to give new notice of that new continued meeting.
So if there's a meeting posted and scheduled, DHHS did this. They got to the community center and someone else was using it. So they moved the meeting. So you can't do that, right?
You are allowed to move the meeting.
How do you give people notice of that?
You would have to post it, I would think, at the meeting, the usual meeting place, that the meeting is not being held here, it's being held at
Right, they didn't.
this other location. You know, you have to give the public as much notice as possible. And the Open Meetings Act does allow, although it's not in this context, it's in the context of, okay, you have someone who's trying to attend a closed session, or you have someone that's being unruly to the point where you have to adjourn your meeting and have it held elsewhere.
So if we decided at 5 minutes to 5, we're not gonna have the meeting here, we're moving it, that's okay? If we just put a sign up?
You're definitely going to want to put a sign up. It's not ideal.
But it's not against the law.
It wouldn't be illegal to move the meeting. provided you provide notice to the public as best you can. That's, I mean, it all comes back to the same general principle. The idea is you want public at your meetings. You know, for purposes of inclusion and,
But which goes
Input.
back, because when I posed this to Broad Kendrick, I got another, they said, no, you cannot do that, you have to cancel the meeting. You can't just move it with no notice, with 4 minutes of notice.
canceling it would be the better option. It depends, I guess, on how far you're moving it. Are you moving it to a different room in the same building, or are you moving it across
it's
town?
across town.
Because that does matter. I mean, going from here to out there or here to upstairs is going to be different than here to, you know, somewhere, a different building, here to the courthouse, for example.
Sounds like if someone feels like they've been impeded from participation, they're gonna sue. And that's what we want to avoid.
Well, and
But again, it goes back to what Greg's saying, so I got two different answers.
Right. And she said that. She said you're gonna get different answers from different firms because it's so great. No one knows what's going on. I think I know less now than I did when I walked in here.
that does
So
not
I
feel
thought that
helpful.
meeting with all the lawyers, I thought I had a good
No,
handle on
but
this
she-
once ago.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a general question?
Sure.
It sounds to me like from what you're saying so far, that this meeting we're having right now, even though it is an open meeting and we're doing it formally, and I believe it's on YouTube and all that, it actually didn't have to be legally, because this is only informational, we're not deciding anything. Would that be a true statement?
That would be a true statement, although it seems like there are things that have come up in discussion where I'm really happy we're in an open meeting right now.
Right, and we never intended for it not to be. I'm just trying to make sure I'm understanding the law, that in the future, if we just have something that is like this, informational and discussion, it wouldn't necessarily have been needed to be posted and everything, so we could have done an impromptu thing. Hey, something's come up, everybody come here and we'll it's possible. I have no plans to do so.
Well, I wouldn't have a conversation, but yes, you could gather information as long as all you were doing was gathering information and you weren't.
Information involves discussion, question, and answer,
It
as
does,
we have done here.
but you're
General.
asking questions of me as opposed to deliberating towards something that's going to impact the residents of Shiawassee County.
As a general rule, you can gather whenever you want to, as long as you do it 18 hours, or with 18 hours notice.
But we can't vote, we can't sit here and deliberate and vote to like abolish the OMA. So I mean, there's no decision we can make here, right? I mean, we're not gonna vote on this. You're just giving us information, we're asking you questions for information.
Right. You know, it's not, I mean, throwing out something wild, I guess. You know, it's not that you're saying, okay, you know, now that I've heard all this, I'm gonna make a resolution that we adopt certain procedures of our OMA, and here's what they're gonna be, and that elicits debate and discussion, and at the end of the day, you have a resolution about a new OMA policy. That would be a problem. But if all you're doing is listening to me try to give general answers to what are clearly convoluted, fact-specific questions, and you're just gaining as much information as you can from this process, that is not violative of the OMA.
Now the recess, it's 6:45. Can we say, can the chair recess us for an hour, 2 hours, go to dinner and come back with no notice?
I am
Yes.
actually really hungry,
We're
so.
not doing that.
No, I know, but I'm just asking, could the chair recess us to tomorrow morning with no notice?
Well, as I indicated, it's 36, less than 36
Right.
hours, so
Right.
yes.
Yeah.
Especially this meeting, since this meeting isn't necessarily an OMA meeting to begin with.
Mhm.
So it would have to be stated at the meeting, we're recessing for 6 hours.
Right.
So,
You
Well,
have to
well,
give
we
a
can't-
public.
that's less shady.
Every TV program, we'll reconvene in the morning.
Yeah.
Now, the other thing too, when I talk about, 18 hours notice, if you're posting, say, in the lobby, and people can't get into the lobby for part of that 18 hours, that time doesn't count towards your 18-hour time. They have to have access to the notice for 18 hours as well. So if if you're having a special meeting that requires 18 hours notice, it needs to be posted, say, on the website. And there's some specific requirements for posting on the website. It has to be included on the homepage, or if it's on a separate web page dedicated to public notices, it has to have a conspicuous link on the homepage notifying people that, hey, here's this, these special requirements, or this special meeting. But as long as you have a public that has access to the notice for 18 hours and your notice is posted 18 hours, that's what protects you in terms of a special meeting. And do we want to take a break?
No, let's get this.
I think if anybody just individually needs to use the bathroom,
Yeah.
they can do that. I mean,
We can keep a quorum if one person at a time leaves.
There can be a rare issue where you call an emergency session in the event of a severe and imminent threat to health, safety, or welfare of the public. If 2/3 of the members decide that a delay would be detrimental or lessen the efforts to respond to the threat, I would hope this would never come up. If it does, the OMA has a specific, line by line, here's things that you have to do in terms of making paper copies of the notice available to the public at the next meeting, explaining why you couldn't comply with the 18-hour requirement, posting things on the website, doing certain things within a certain time frame. I mean, it gets really involved, obviously, for the reasons that we've been talking about all evening, that the OMA has a default of openness, accountability, transparency, availability to the public. But if you need more details about that. All right, so in terms of public attendance at the meeting, you can't take attendance. Having people sign in, making them identify themselves is problematic. You can indicate, and I don't know why anyone would do this, but they had a situation where they allowed people to go around the room and say what their name was, and if you didn't want to, you just said pass, and they let them know you don't have to identify yourself. But you can't make them identify themselves in order to attend your meetings. In fact, the Attorney General has gone so far as to say is if you're in a building with security where you have to write your name down in order to come into the building, you should move your meetings to a different building. Because that's...
Can we require them to identify themselves in order to address the vote?
That is different, and that is something you can't do. You are allowed to establish rules requiring them to identify themselves in order to speak, because now they've gone beyond just merely attending or listening. They're actually participating. And in that sense, you can.
If I may, going back to taking attendance, I've been to several meetings where they have a sign-in sheet. I don't know that they make everyone sign in, but it's generally encouraged that you do. Is that?
townships do it.
Yeah, and that's what I'm thinking of.
Yeah.
I can't think of one that doesn't.
Right.
Never mind, we didn't do that.
Well, what about when at the courthouse, when with the pandemic and everything, and they were tracking people, and they were there?
That's our question.
Yeah, but at that time, we also didn't have public meetings. I mean, everybody kind of went remote or very socially distanced, and you didn't have...
We still had ours.
Did you?
Yeah.
That's impressive.
Court is still open,
Wow.
offices are still open.
Yep.
Did you have signage?
Well,
No.
for the courthouse, they had to have sign-in sheets.
Yeah, because they had to know how many people were gonna be in the clerk's office, because it was by square footage.
And,
So,
yeah, so.
Yeah, which, the courts are open, but not, taking a sign-in in court is a little different than taking a sign-in at a public meeting. I would not recommend a sign-in sheet for any public meeting that you have.
I'll let my townships know.
So,
I'll just keep it to myself.
You can also establish time limits on individual speech. If you want to limit people to say, okay, you can only talk for 3 minutes, or you have 5 minutes to address, or whatever it is. You can make a rule that limits the amount of time an individual can talk. What you can't do is limit the time that the public can talk as a group. You can't say, okay, we're going to give a half hour to public comment and have whoever wants to talk, but if you're outside of that time, you're out. That's not allowed. You also cannot prevent them from recording, broadcasting, taking pictures, all of the things that you think of when you think of public taking notice and making a record. All of that is allowed specifically under the Act.
Yeah.
Now, if you have a circumstance where you have 50 people that are going to speak on one topic and they're all expected to say a similar thing, you can encourage them to have a spokesperson to speak for them and present their ideas. But you can't require it. If the 50 people want to get up there and say their thing 50 times, you have to let them get up there and say their thing 50 times.
But we do not have to let them pass their time on to someone else. We've had that happen, and I have said no.
Yeah, you're allowed to limit individual speech. So yeah, everyone, you can say, hey, 3 minutes is 3 minutes for everybody. You don't get to... Now, if they're saying, look, us 15 people are going to get up, but if you let this guy talk, you know, we'll keep it to 7. It might be worth the negotiation just to save yourself the time, but you can't require them to do that. The other thing you can do is decide when public comment happens. There's nothing in the OMA that says they get to speak before a particular issue is decided, or they can only speak after a particular issue is decided. That is up to this board. If you wanted to have public comment at the beginning, or public comment at the end, or public comment both, that's totally allowable. All of that is acceptable. In terms of kicking people out, you can only remove individuals for a breach of the peace at that meeting. I've had a municipality recently where they said, yeah, we trespassed him and he doesn't want to come back anyway, and all I'm thinking is, thank goodness he doesn't want to come back anyway, because you can't just kick people out of your meetings for good. That is not acceptable under the OMA. If they're breaching that particular meeting and there's a breach of the peace, yes, you can have them removed. But you can't remove them prospectively from future meetings because they're too unruly or they're too problematic.
Okay. You get your life threat. Just have it. And that person, we didn't react to him because there was protection. Now, let's say that I go to the judge and say, I need a personal protection notice.
In that circumstance,
And the judge says, you're right, Mr. Allen.
you're not keeping him out under the Open Meetings Act. You're keeping him out pursuant to a court order of protection. That's different.
Okay.
You know, you couldn't be in Walmart with him either. It doesn't mean that Walmart isn't a public place. It's just,
It's everywhere.
it's the effect that you're here and he's here.
Okay.
Now, if he has a problem with that, he needs to petition the court that, well, if you do this, I can't attend council meetings and it's important for me to participate in my government, whatever, and he can try to sell his story to the judge and see what the judge will
I
let
hope
him
they
do.
keep him.
But, yeah, you know, obviously, a court order not to be around a particular person is going to trump any public place. But you're not keeping him out under the OMA, you're keeping him out because of a court order.
Yeah. Good to know.
An exception being for closed sessions, you can have people removed by law enforcement if they're refusing to leave. If you're going into closed session and someone absolutely refuses to leave the room, you can ask that they be removed by law enforcement. Your other option is to recess your meeting and convene at a new location where that person's not going to be. Okay, so during COVID, we had an unprecedented kind of circumstance, and people were allowed to attend meetings remotely. Apparently that didn't happen here, which is really amazing. You're probably the only community I know that didn't, but I guess I didn't take a poll either. Before COVID, there was basically a loophole in the OMA because it didn't give any guidance whatsoever as to whether or not an individual member could attend remotely, either through phone or through Zoom or through whatever means, if there was a quorum physically present. And so municipalities could take advantage of that and maybe have someone attend remotely on occasion when you had a quorum present physically in the building. With COVID, they rewrote the OMA to change remote participation. And they made it so that if you had someone that had military duty, a medical condition, or a statewide or local state of emergency, or a state of disaster, you could have remote meetings where people could attend remote. And there were, you had to allow two-way communication. They had to say where they were in terms of, where they were attending the meeting from. You had to allow contact with them prior to the meeting. You had to notify people, okay, this is how you can get a hold of this commissioner who's not going to be attending in person. Here's, the way that you can participate. Here's the number, here's the email, whatever it is. You could have public comments. You could have them read into the record at the meeting. There's like all these different requirements that kind of went in with COVID. Those have all sunsetted. The only one, according to the OMA, that is still valid after December 31st of last year is the military duty. That is the only one that allows for remote participation of a public body member. Now, 2 senators requested from the Attorney General a Attorney General opinion about the OMA and how it complies or doesn't comply or conflicts with or doesn't conflict with the American with Disabilities Act. Because under the American with Disabilities Act, you have to give reasonable accommodation to someone who has a disability, as that term is defined by the Act. And it may or may not have something to do with the fact that the Attorney General's significant other spouse has an immunocompromised circumstance, but the Attorney General found that a remote participation may be an accommodation under the ADA for public body members. The Attorney General took the opinion that the OMA is silent as to accommodations under the ADA, looked to the ADA and said this could be a reasonable accommodation depending on different factors. I am approaching this with caution because Attorney General's opinions, while they are persuasive to courts and binding on state agencies, they are not binding on municipalities. And while the OMA does not address the American with Disabilities Act, it does use the phrase disability as included in the definition of a medical condition, which is one of the provisions that's sunsetted. And I think it's created a problem for municipalities because if you have someone that has a disability under the ADA, do you now run into a conflict with someone who has a disability under the OMA where one requires that you allow them to attend remotely if that is a reasonable accommodation, and the other says you cannot allow them to attend remotely. I think it's problematic. I think if the circumstances comes up, you need to have a good discussion with your attorney, your corporation counsel, and decide how that should be addressed, whether or not the factors of ADA are met. Some of the things they look at, do they have a qualifying disability? Is it limiting their life activities in some way? Does it impact their ability to physically attend the meeting? These are the kinds of things that the Attorney General was thinking of. And then it has to be reasonable. Has the public body in the past provided for remote access to its public meetings? Does it have sufficient resources to promote the public access to their meetings? So like I said, I approach this one with caution just because the OMA is binding on you, the ADA is binding on you, but I'm not necessarily convinced that the Attorney General's opinion, which is not binding on you, did a deep enough analysis of how these two intersect. So I just say that with a grain of caution. All right, so closed sessions, which we've been talking about, are only for enumerated reasons. Again, this is strictly construed. They look at those exemptions very, very narrowly. The burden of proof is on you to prove that they apply. And so it's not just, a mechanism for hiding dirty laundry or embarrassing topics or touchy topics. It has to fit within the reasons that are permitted under the OMA, with the default being that meetings are public. So in terms of your permitted reasons, if you have officer-employee issues where you're discussing their dismissal, their suspension, discipline, and you're hearing complaints and charges, or you're conducting a periodic personnel evaluation, here's the caveat. All of that only applies if the employee requests it. If the employee does not request a closed session, you cannot go into closed session. It doesn't matter how personal or how vitriolic or how concerning it is to have this stuff in public, unless maybe you could fit in under the FOIA privacy exemption, but the problem you have there is they've already said they don't care if it's public.
So by default, it is public unless requested? Is that the
Yes.
case? Okay.
Yes.
So when is the request going to be 1 minute before the meeting?
The request can be during the meeting.
Okay.
And vice versa. You could be in closed session and they say, you know what, I'm done with this. I want to go back to open session, and you all have to leave closed session and go back to open.
Okay.
Yeah, it is 100% employee determinative. It's also to deal, I said, with complaints and charges. Again, they look to the dictionary. A complaint being something that is the cause or subject of protest or outcry, or a formal allegation against a party. A charge is to make an assertion against by ascribing guilt for some offense, or to assert as an accusation. So ideally, they would be in writing if you're going to have this kind of a meeting. And then periodic personnel evaluations, they really mean periodic personnel evaluations. If it's something you do every year, that's periodic. If it's you're suddenly deciding, okay, let's have an evaluation of employee X, it's never had an employee evaluation before, that actually could be problematic.
The one that seems a little slippery to me is complaints.
What's that?
The one that seems a little slippery to me is complaints. Charges seem formal. For periodic personnel, that seems obvious dismissal. So that's all fine. What constitutes a complaint? If we're in the middle of a meeting and I start kvetching about, someone in the employee of the county, well, that's not open meeting, that's a different thing entirely, because the employee isn't here. I withdraw that, because I don't think it matters for this thing, never mind.
Yeah, it's basically, yeah, instead of say it to my face, it's say it in a closed session. You know, if the employee is the one saying, I want a closed session, that needs to be honored. If they're saying, I'm done with closed session, that needs to be honored.
Is that for any criticism of an employee?
Well, again, criticism, I mean, in the Webster's Dictionary, the complaint terminology was defined as a formal allegation against a party.
Oh,
So
okay.
if you had something that's, I would expect it to be in writing in a more formalistic as opposed to, man, I don't like that person over there. If it's,
Now, why didn't Joe
something with
get the
structure.
snow shovel, before the meeting? That's a criticism, it's not a formal complaint. Now, Joe might not like me saying that, why it wasn't the snow shovel.
Probably should be a formal complaint, should probably be a write-up, and it's
Yeah,
personal.
but just,
There's no joke.
it's hard to say what
it's feeling bad for Joe.
Yeah.
what a commissioner might say in the heat of the moment or without thinking. It just,
Well, and, meetings can get very heated and people can say lots of things, but I think of a complaint as being more, something more than just
You're about to
a
be
spur of the
written up.
moment.
You can have your opportunity to discuss, do you want this private or
Right, if you're looking like in an abusive office or an alleged embezzlement or something a little more.
right, but you're getting the obvious things, that are obvious complaints. And I know that outside of the OMA, employees have certain rights to privacy and to formal hearings and so on. But it looks like the OMA, you're telling me, adds another layer to that. Or you're talking about, with respect to the employee's rights in other areas of the law, that the employee can request the closed session and we have to honor that.
Yeah, it sounds like by default, everything's public,
Mhm.
unless they say, no, it isn't. And then we say, oh, well, I guess it isn't. And then, even then, they have a right to say, oh, you said something I want public, or want public. Could they then, again, say, really toy with us and say, not public, no, now we're public, now that this guy said that I wanted the public to hear, now let's go back into closed session, not that. I'm sure that's it.
If someone's bouncing back and forth.
I know this is such a stupid, weird.
Yeah, I haven't seen it happen. That's not to say it couldn't happen, and I could see an employee doing that, but I think that would subject them to further discipline at that point. I guess it depends on who the employee is, who their supervisor is, and whether or not they're an at-will or not, or you can just, yeah, with a little more detail, we could kind of flesh that out a bit. And it would be an interesting thing. I'd actually kind of like to see it happen, just to see what would happen, but.
We have enough interesting things here, thank you.
Until we have PTSD, without any more questions.
It's not uncommon, and it tends to come in waves. You'll have a ton of cases, and then nothing for a long time, and then a ton of cases. It tends to do that, and I'm not sure why that is. There's an ebb and flow to litigation, and this is no exception. And you see the same thing in employment law. You'll have one disgruntled employee, and all of a sudden you have 7 lawsuits because it just kind of feeds itself. And then you get through them, and then there's nothing for a long time again, hopefully. And then if you're doing CBA strategies, negotiations, you're allowed to go in closed session for that. And that, it's either side. If either side wants to have a closed session to kind of discuss, that's when that's done. One second here. And it's not really a pure privacy issue under FOIA, is how I think about it. Just because you got this contrast, you got this kind of back and forth tension where you have, on the one hand, this is an employee, he's being accused of something, it may or may not have happened, you know, it's being addressed, and that person has a degree of privacy. On the other hand, they're a public employee, and their actions matter and impact the public, and you have a right, you know, you're paying their salary, you have a right to find out, you know, what's going on. So there's a bit of a back and forth when it comes to public employee kind of circumstances. Obviously, if the board is talking in open session about how much they think they should pay for a piece of property, that's going to cause a problem for the board in terms of buying that property. You know, you can't put a range on your purchasing if the person who you're buying it from is sitting in the audience. So obviously, to consider a purchase or a lease of property up until the time that you actually obtain your purchase or your option to purchase, your purchase agreement or your lease, you're able to go into closed session to discuss those types of things. To consult with an attorney concerning trial and settlement, again, this has to be specific pending litigation. And it's another rule of statutory construction when you're looking at a statute is every single word has to have a purpose. The idea is that the legislature chose those words for a reason, and you're not going to have a statute that has extra words that don't mean anything. So when they look at this, they look at specific and pending and litigation. It has to be about a particular case. It can't just be, you know, oh, we want to talk about generally how we handle litigation or this type of litigation. It needs to be specific litigation. It also needs to be pending. If the case hasn't been brought yet, you just know this guy's gonna sue, but he hasn't sued yet, you can't go into closed session to discuss that because it's not pending litigation. If you've gone through and you've gotten a judgment and now you're deciding, okay, am I gonna, you know, how are we gonna deal with this judgment? You can't discuss that in closed session because it's no longer pending. You have a judgment in the case. So it has to be literally specific pending litigation. And then as an added layer over that, it has to have a detrimental or financial impact on the case in order to talk about it in closed session. And believe it or not, I've had cases where a board has decided to talk in open session with plaintiff's counsel sitting in the audience about how they were going to approach litigation. Obviously, it was a fractured board in terms of how they felt things should have been handled. But if it's going to impact your case, you're allowed to go into closed session as long as you have a case pending at the time.
And what if we, as a board, want to sue someone or bring litigation?
It has not been brought yet, so
Right.
you could not discuss that in closed session. More likely, in that circumstance, you're going to get to the one we're going to do next.
Sorry for jumping
or
ahead.
the one after.
All right.
Yeah, here, let me just click. Materially exempt under state or federal law. That's what you're going to rely on because you're going to want to meet with your attorney. You're going to need a written opinion to do that. The way this works is the exemption is to discuss material that's exempt from discussion or disclosure under state statute. The state statute that you're relying on is the exemption in FOIA about attorney-client and work product.
Okay.
But FOIA only applies to documents. You have to have public records. So you cannot go into closed session to verbally discuss with your attorney what your attorney's opinion is because that's not a public record. Therefore, it's not exempt under FOIA. It doesn't, FOIA wouldn't apply in that circumstance because you don't have a public document, you don't have a public record. So first you have to have a written opinion from your attorney, and then you can go into closed session to discuss that written opinion. So, a bit of a round there, but
How will you get a written opinion from an attorney without first talking about it in open session?
well, you would either have your, one of the commissioners would request a written opinion from the attorney. Someone would be in contact with the attorney, if not commissioner, someone in management would be reaching out to say, hey, we have this issue, we're thinking about suing, we'd like to get your thoughts, can you send us a memo?
But you can't, it would have to be the commissioner thought, because if you said we thought, that means it implied you've already discussed it with your commissioners outside of an open session.
Yeah, that is not something you want to discuss outside of open session. Obviously, you're going to be using taxpayer dollars to fund the litigation, so the public would have an interest in finding out, how that was going to play out. And then again, to consider the contents of an application for employment or appointment if confidentiality is requested. Again, this is someone saying, I'd rather you didn't put my application out there right now. But again, this is just to consider the application contents, because they are asking to be a public employee or they're looking for a public appointment. You're putting yourself out there. So you don't get to stay private forever. The interviews associated with this need to be at a public meeting. The hiring decision, the contract, that all needs to be, to the extent possible at the public meeting. You're not going to have those kinds of things occur behind closed doors.
Now, ask another question. Going back to the appointments for the commissions, can a commissioner meet with those people individually, one-on-one, or does that need to be in this meeting or in a open meeting with the quorum present?
Given that the OMA specifically says interviews have to be held in public, I would hold them in public. And it's specific to that closed session exemption. It's written right in, that the interviews have to be public. And then in terms of, these are the ones that you as commissioners have to worry about in terms of potential closed sessions. Other ones deal with primary and secondary and post-secondary, public schools, disciplinary hearings. State legislator party caucuses are one of the things that can be in closed session. Compliance conferences by the Department of Community Health of the state. Public university presidents' searches and committees, those discussions can be held in private, but these are the ones really that as commissioners you need to be focused on. Okay, in terms of who can be in a closed session, obviously commissioners, whoever the committee is comprised of. You can also have employees, pretty much anyone that needs to be there to help you towards your consideration of whatever the issue is. Your attorney, especially if you're doing an attorney-client type circumstance, going over an attorney memo. For that, you can have counsel. Private citizens. It doesn't necessarily, you're not limited to just commissioners or just counsel. You can have people in there that you need to have in there that you need to invite in to help you with making that determination. And it's not that all the public has to attend, but you can say we need these 4 people from, for example, if you were doing some kind of a property buy and you were wanting to talk to an environmental company about the impact of how that's going to affect the pricing or something like that, and you need to have environmentalists there to explain to you what they found in terms of the property and how it's going to affect your purchase price or how they think it should affect your purchase price. That all is allowable. So it doesn't have to be just the commissioners or just council. There was at least one instance in an attorney general opinion. Now granted, this was in 1978. I haven't seen anything to the contrary yet, but that doesn't mean it couldn't happen, where they actually kept out members of the council from a meeting because it was a subcommittee meeting and that council member wasn't a member of that subcommittee and they said you couldn't attend. The Attorney General said that was fine, but again, that's something I would discuss with Corporation Counsel if that's something that's going to come up, because that's clearly an unusual type circumstance. And again, you can forcibly exclude people that shouldn't be there, ask law enforcement to remove them, recess, go where you are in a closed session. In Zoom, sometimes they would break out into a breakout room, or they would actually log off and log into a different Zoom. So there's different ways of addressing that, but you want to make sure that your closed sessions stay closed. Obviously, you go into them through the normal process. You're making a motion, you're doing a second. Again, you don't have to announce it when the meeting starts or even prior to the meeting that you're going to have a closed session. You can decide, you know what, we need a closed session on X. You announce, hey, I move that we go into closed session for whatever purpose you're going in for. You need to have that on the record. You have to have the reason why you're going into a closed session in your minutes, explaining how that is that you ended up in closed session. If you're going in to talk about a particular lawsuit, again, it can be done different ways. My preference would be we're going into closed session to discuss, Smith versus Jones case number, whatever, so that you have public identification of whatever your case is. Or, we're going into closed session to discuss material that's exempt under state and federal statute from disclosure, namely FOIA, because we're going to discuss an attorney-client opinion, or attorney opinion, that type of thing, so that it's clear on the record why you're doing it. You will need a 2/3 roll call vote if it involves the purchase of property, consulting with your attorney about litigation, considering an employment application, or material exempt from disclosure. In those circumstances, you will need a 2/3 vote. And that is 2/3 of the appointed and serving, not 2/3 of the people that are there that day. And then for the other reasons you can go into closed session, you can do that for a majority vote. Like we talked about, when you're in closed session, there's only one topic. It's whatever topic is in front of you. You don't go in to talk about your attorney-client memo and then go off into financing, go off into, restructuring government, go off into whatever. It has to be limited to the purpose that you went into that meeting for. There are to be no substantive actions or decisions made during the closed session. All of your decisions are made in open session. This is just consideration that takes place, or consulting that takes place in the closed session. The only motion you should be making is a motion to leave, which, yes, technically is a motion, but it's not substantive. You're not making a determination on a particular issue or resolution or anything like that. Minutes, you have to have your date, time, and place. You have to have the members that were present and absent, all of the decisions, any purposes of closed sessions, and all of your roll call votes. Minutes are taken in closed session, they're taken in open session, and they're kept separate. You don't mix the two. You shut this one down, do your closed session, close this one out, and go back. These are minimum requirements. It doesn't mean to say that you can't have more in your minutes than what's listed here, but these have to be there.
Now, in the closed session, there would be no decision, right?
There would be no decision, but you would probably have minutes about what was discussed. The details of that kind of vary from clerk to clerk as to how much detail they put in those minutes. Those minutes are not open to the public. They are closed minutes. They're only revealable in certain circumstances that we'll get to. Because again, what happens in closed session stays in closed session. There is a little bit of a debate about if you have something in closed session, if you're considering a document, does that document, is that considered part of the meeting minutes so that it's non-public, or does that become a public document? My take on it would be if it's identified as being something that was in closed session, then it should stay protected. If it's something that could be unrelated to the closed session, then you can do it. If someone did a FOIA request though saying, give me all the documents that you looked at in closed session, that can't happen. That would be exempt. So your proposed minutes have to be in draft form and available 8 days after the meeting. Your approved minutes have to be available 5 days after they've been approved. If you have an audio tape of your minutes, those have to be kept until you have your physical minutes. Once you have your physical minutes, you could destroy them, or you could keep them. It's not, there's no requirement that things have to be shut down. Obviously, the whole purpose of the act is to give the public plenty of involvement, so you could keep them, but you don't have to keep them once you have approved minutes. The fact that they're draft or that they could be subject to revision is not a reason to keep them from the public. If the public asks for them, they can get them, even though they're draft minutes, even though they may have changes. They are actually considered prima facie disclosable. They're assumed to be disclosable, absent some kind of, and again, I can't think of an exception other than if they were closed session minutes. They are approved at the next meeting, and that's true of both types of minutes. Your final minutes have to show all of the original text, and then any modifications also have to be shown, so people can look at it and see exactly what was changed in your minutes.
You mean what was changed at the meeting itself?
Yes, and this is, and I'm laughing because we had this come up in a case that I'm going to tell you about. Ideally, yes, you're going to look at your minutes, you're going to make your changes at your meeting, you're going to approve them, and that's going to be the end of it. We had a case where the clerk had gone into a closed session, did the closed session minutes. The council had come back to open session, but the clerk forgot to go back and do her open session closing minutes. What she did was she was doing the open session and then went into closed session. So she went and did her closed session minutes, and she forgot to go back and finish doing the open session. So the end of the open session minutes was missing the final wrap-up. And council didn't catch it. They approved the minutes without changes. And then after the meeting, they were putting up all the chairs, and the president came over and said, well, you didn't say that we went back into open session in these minutes. I'm just looking at this and thinking, wait, we're missing this. And she's like, oh my gosh, that's right, what do I do? And he said, well, you've got to reflect in the minutes what happened. So she said, okay, and he said, just put in there what happened. She said, okay. So she put in there what happened. Well, of course, they're sued, and they say, oh, you did these minutes in violation of the OMA, that it wasn't, you willfully violated the OMA because changes have to be at the meeting, and it was after the meeting, and changes have to be approved by council, and these were never approved by council, and you never went back to council and said, hey, I made this change in the minutes, approve them again. And if you had, it would have been untimely because they have to be done at the next meeting, and that wouldn't have been the next meeting, and it turned into this crazy mess. And basically, what we did with it, we said, look, there was no intent to violate the OMA. In fact, what the clerk was doing was trying to make it so that the public had the information about what did in fact happen at the meeting. And there's no question that it happened at the meeting. that this was the action that was taken. Now, it didn't make the minutes the way it should have. The minutes were corrected to give the public more information about that meeting. So the intent wasn't to violate the OMA. The intent is actually to promote the OMA by giving the public more information. The judge agreed. We did get that case dismissed. Obviously, that's not ideal. Ideal is to read the minutes carefully and make sure everything's there when you vote on it, because otherwise it does get a little dicey. But again, you're working towards the good faith of, I'm following the OMA, I'm doing my best, I'm making good faith efforts to give the public as much information as they can get. To the extent that you can argue substantial compliance, that goes a long way with the court. So again, closed session has separate minutes. They have to be approved in the open meeting, although you can hold a closed session to consider the approval of the minutes. If there's some issue with the minutes that needs discussion, you can actually go into closed session to discuss your minutes because they're exempt under FOIA from production. In fact, they're exempt under state law from production. They can only be disclosed if required to in a civil action under sections 10, 11, and 13. Section 10 is challenging the validity of a decision. Someone comes in and they want to actually reverse a decision that you made because they claim it was non-compliant with the OMA. Section 11 is a civil action that either compels compliance or enjoins non-compliance. You're looking for an injunction kind of a circumstance. Section 13 is where they're arguing that you intentionally violated the OMA and you're subject to civil penalties for that to them. Section 12 obviously was skipped. Section 12 is criminal penalties. That can be a problem. The minutes from a closed session can be destroyed a year and a day after they're approved. So once you pass that point, those minutes can go. You don't have to keep them any longer than that. It'd take up a lot of space sometimes. In terms of fixing unintentional violations, minutes, again, we had that circumstance with the minutes. It's not, there's no explanation in the statute about what you do if your minutes are wrong. It's silent as to that issue. So to the extent you can do good faith, show that you're trying to promote public awareness and involvement, you're going to be better off. If you have an issue with one of your meetings, you can reenact your meeting and have the decision again. You don't have to wait for litigation to do this. You can just decide, you know what, we had that meeting, we had that get together where we all talked about this. It actually should have been a meeting. Have a council meeting, put it on the agenda, revisit it, do it all over again, and you've just preserved your decision. So now that decision cannot be invalidated by the courts. If it's reenacted in a properly noticed and scheduled and properly held public meeting, you will not get it invalidated. Also, the OMA doesn't just invalidate a decision because there's a simple error or there was some inadvertence. It actually has a fairly high standard. So, to wrap it up, in terms of penalties, first good news, there's a presumption that you complied with the OMA. Public bodies are always presumed to have acted constitutionally and lawfully and in compliance. So even though you had the burden of showing that you didn't violate it, there's a presumption that you didn't violate it. Now, bad news. The Attorney General, actually the county prosecutor, or any person can file a civil action trying to invalidate a decision that you made because you violated the OMA. Either because the meeting wasn't open, it wasn't available to the public, the decision was made outside of a public meeting, or a quorum deliberated on the decision outside of public view inappropriately. In all of those circumstances, the court's got to look at whether or not there was compliance with the OMA. And the standard in that instance is that either it's impaired the rights of the public, or if you failed to give notice and that failure caused an impaired right of the public to participate, in that circumstance you can be reversed. It can basically make it like your decision never happened. Which is why if you think that there's an issue reenactment is the safest way to preserve your decisions. The most recent case about this was actually last October, Rada versus Miller, where it was Ludington City Council were approving a settlement. They unanimously voted to go into closed session to discuss it. Following the closed session, they unanimously voted to approve it. Everything's good. Settlement was signed. However, only 4 of the 7 total council members were present, so there wasn't a 2/3 roll call vote. So what they did was they went back, they reenacted, and then they cured it. Plaintiff argued it can't be cured after the fact, and the court said, no, absolutely it can be cured after the fact. You can reenact a disputed decision in order to prevent invalidation. You don't have to be sued before you do it. It's available to you at any time. Now, in terms of an action to invalidate, those have to be 60 days after the minutes are available to the public. For contracts and bids and that kind of thing, it's 30 days. So if they want to invalidate a decision that you've made, they have between 30 and 60 days, depending on what the issue is. They can also seek an injunction. If they think that you're violating the OMA, they can say, hey, look, there's violations, there's going to be repeated violations if you don't enter an injunction preventing this from happening. If they're successful, they will get their court costs and their actual attorney fees. There's also civil liability for intentional violations. Then you get actual and the person gets actual and exemplary damages of $500 plus their court costs. For both of these things, they have 180 days to file. So if they're wanting to invalidate your decision, they got to move quick. But if they're just looking to enjoin or for civil liability, they have more time to file those types of actions.
So I have a quick question. So when we have a person that says that the county paid them $10,000 in an OMA settlement, that wouldn't it be possible they would be limited to the $500?
It depends on what their actual damages were. Because again, it's their damages plus the exemplary damages is the 500. So
What would your damages, I guess?
if they got paid $10,000, my guess is it includes some award for attorney fees or some consideration of attorney fees.
Right.
But yeah, I
But those
would-
are two separate things, right? I mean, the $500 and the attorney thing.
Yes.
Okay, right.
But
So-
they're usually in one check.
Right, but you don't get $10,000 plus another $10,000 in attorney fees.
Only if you could show that kind of damages, but you'd have to really work to show that kind of damages from a meeting. I guess it would depend on what decision was made. I mean, if they're claiming that you violated the OMA and based on that, they didn't get a county position that they were entitled to.
So they would have to have some personal loss of,
There would have to be some kind of damages of some kind that they personally sustained to have that kind of damages on an OMA. Now, recreating your decision does not affect these two types of lawsuits. It will prevent invalidation, but it does not prevent civil liability or an injunction. Oh, and I turned the page and read my notes and take that back. So a civil action for intentional violations, a civil action for actual and exemplary damages of not more than 500 total. So the rest of that would have to be either court costs or attorney's fees in bringing the action. They're not allowed to file more than one action under this section against a particular public official for a particular meeting. So if they're claiming there was a notice issue and there was a attendance issue and there was a vote issue and there was deliberation issue, they're only allowed one action. They can't hook all those together. Now, they can hook together a claim for injunction and a claim for invalidation and a claim for damages. They can make all that part of one suit. But they can't file separate suits for saying, okay, in this meeting on the 23rd of June, these 5 things happened, so I'm bringing 5 lawsuits. And then there's the potential for criminal penalties. For intentional misdemeanor, violations can be a misdemeanor. The first offense, you're looking at a $1,000 fine. For a second offense, in your same term, it can be $2,000 and even imprisonment. So your best practices is, of course, always to err on the side of inclusion and openness. To the extent you can have things public, let them be public. Increased public access does not violate the Act. In fact, it promotes it. So if you want to do more than the Act requires, and some municipalities are doing that either by allowing the public to attend via Zoom, not their actual board members, but members of the public to give additional access, because they say that they've gotten more participation with that happening. So that's another good way to smooth the road during any lawsuit, where you can say, look, we've gone above and beyond. We've done all these things to involve the public and include the public. It's always helpful. Obviously, keep group emails and text to a minimum. If you do have group text, do not debate the issues. Don't work toward a decision in your text. Work toward a decision in the boardroom. And when in doubt, seek advice from your legal counsel. Every attorney that you talk to might have a different opinion given what the issue is and based on their experience, their nuance, what the court has done, what the particular plaintiff is. But they're the ones that are going to have to deal with it the most, so definitely talk to your legal counsel about it. In terms of resources, the legislature, of course, makes the statute available online. There's also an OMA handbook that's available online that has a lot of what I covered tonight, to the extent you need to go back over it. It's very recently updated. It has the ADA COVID stuff, so I know it's extremely recent. And that's another good source. Is there anything I can cover that we haven't covered? Or anything you'd like me to cover in more detail? Probably not by this point. So thank you.
Thank you.
If there are no more questions, we're adjourned.